I think this is a place where I've seen a lot of traction in the work that I've done with churches, and I call it the 4 buckets of church mission. And here's my experience. Here's what I'm learning, or what I have seen as I begin to work with churches. That, let's go to the next slide. That as we try towards these kinds of things in sustainability, the big idea that we're talking about, what we end up with is all kinds of tensions that are happening between 4 particular domains. I want to go through them real quick. That when we're talking about church missions, it really depends on who you are as to what you see church missions is. The individual is basically looking at church missions through a volunteer experience. And I define what's going on in that particular domain right there about spiritual formation, because as we come to a better understanding of our faith, we understand that whatever God has done for us, He's not just done for us. We are meant to be a blessing to others as well in the process. And so something begins to happen within us, but when the individual is looking at missions, they're looking at it in many ways as a positive volunteer experience. Now, if you're the mission pastor of a church, you also tend to look at that whole thing from that standpoint, because you are given the job of being the pastor for individuals within your church. And so you're looking at trying to find ways of plugging people into mission experiences that will help them grow in their spiritual formation. Does it make sense? My job, my responsibility as the mission pastor is to help that individual become more spiritually mature and understand that they've been given gifts for God's glory and the good of other people. And so you want them into opportunities where but your focus on mission right now is on the individual and their spiritual formation. That's if you're the mission pastor. On the other hand, if you're in charge if your responsibility within the church is to mobilize and create strategies, and oftentimes that's the pastor. The pastor's job is to mobilize and deploy resources. That person may not be in charge of all the spiritual formation that's going on, but as Gary Kendall stands on this stage every Sunday, or as Dan Diebel stands on that stage over there, or as Adam Hamilton stands on that stage down the street a little bit, they realize that in their particular position, nobody in the church has the greater opportunity to mobilize resources than they do because of the power of the pulpit. And I guarantee you that any really good pastor understands the power that they have to mobilize and ultimately deploy resources into something. So that as the pastor looks at things, and what's going on stage every Sunday morning is he or she has that 30 or 40 or 60 minutes, depending on how long it goes in your church, to convey ideas to people. And then you get to the end of your sermon and you're giving them the so what, what's next sort of a thing. And a good pastor is creating easy on-ramps for individuals to be mobilized into the work of the church. And so when a pastor looks at church missions, oftentimes they're looking through the lenses of how do I mobilize and deploy people into church missions. Let me tell you why that's important. It is really, really difficult to put up a 30 or 60-second video about development. It is very easy to put up a 30 or 60-second video about relief and betterment, to show lines of kids with putting on tennis shoes and all the things that we've done that's easy. And you know what happens as a pastor? You flip that video up there of these kids standing in line and getting the food all of the relief and betterment stuff. You put that 30-second video up there, and there will be crowds around the table out there signing up to be a part of that. You see what's going on? My job as a pastor is to mobilize and deploy people into that sort of thing. It's really difficult for me to get people mobilized and deployed into these complex things. So please, ministry staff, give me those 30 or 60-second anecdotal stories that are best told through relief and betterment. Are you tracking with me? You see some of the tensions that are going on right now? If I'm the mission pastor, my role is to get people into missional work. Getting people into complex development things is really hard, but getting people into relief and betterment is really easy. And they start to feel that they're growing in their faith. That if you're as a pastor, you're trying to mobilize and deploy people from the pulpit, you need those 30 or 60-second anecdotal stories. So it depends on who you are in the church, it's what's going on. But there's others that are looking at it from the partnership. lens. And what we just heard from Casey is that as their church has started to move more towards the whole idea of sustainability, it forced them, and it will force any church to begin to say, it's not just what we're going to do for the individual in my church, and it's not just about the numbers of people that we can put in there, but it's also about the partnership. How do I develop this partnership? And so if you're somebody like Casey in that role and you're trying to do that, he's got all kinds of pressures because you've got people on the one hand telling you that we need this kind of stuff to happen in this kind of way, but you also come to learn that the pace at which things happen over here in that world is totally different. And so Casey is solving a whole different problem. In fact, it's easier to mobilize resources on the resource side of this thing more quickly and in greater number than he can realistically deploy in healthy ways on the other side of the equation. Do you see the pinch that he's in now? And he's struggling now with all these resources that want to be deployed in these ways and a context that can't quite handle them in this way. And if you are in his role, and then you've got a pastor who needs this 30-second thing, and then you've got a mission pastor who needs to be developing people in this sort of way. And can you see what's going on within churches and why there's all of this tension? And then if you get totally outside of the churches that we're talking about and you go to the community and if you can create an honest opportunity, and that's what we heard when we finally got to the reality of the co-op. I am sick and tired of being a positive volunteer experience for rich white folks. When people in the community can finally say what's on their heart, they're frustrated. They're frustrated because of the dance that we have to do in the partnership. They're frustrated because the church can mobilize resources towards relief and betterment 100 times easier than they can mobilize resources toward the long-term community development needs to be done. They're frustrated because the average church is more interested in the spiritual formation of the volunteer than they are in the difficulties that are going on in the community. Is this making sense? The only reason that I bring all of that to you is that I believe that there are things that we can do and that we have to do. Go to the next slide real quick, and I'll run through them real quick. That in the individual, it's about spiritual formation. It's about how we get out in front of this journey. I think that the journey that the average person is going through is to expose, engage, and ultimately trying to bring them to what I call redemptive entanglement. That really is missional maturity. How can churches in their discipleship process expose people to things, engage them in meaningful work, and ultimately bring them to that point where they're understanding that God has made them and called them to a particular passion, at which point they become redemptively entangled. And redemptive entanglement to me is best illustrated by the way that a parent feels about a child. There's a lot of things you might do to me that I'll wash my hands of you. I love you and I'll love you at a distance. But my kids I am so redemptively entangled to my children that they can do anything and I cannot not show up for my kids. And when you look at the story of the Christian faith, redemptive entanglement is tied into the story of Christ. It's the incarnation. It is him coming, putting on skin and living with us and being a part of who we are. And I believe that's part of spiritual formation for those that have been called into that particular role is to help people get to that point of understanding where their redemptive entanglement is. That's part of what missions has to be about, but it can't be all about that. And it can't be only about that. Otherwise, we get ourselves into incredibly difficult situations in which we're no longer relevant to the context that we're trying to help. Go to the next slide real quick. At the church mobilization piece, it's all about mobilizing and deploying resources. And here I think that we've been talking about is how do we mobilize resources towards relief? How do we mobilize resources towards betterment? And how do we mobilize resources to development? And those are complex kinds of things requiring people to sit and think difficult and work through difficult scenarios about what it looks like. But it is getting to the point where you start mapping and tracking various things that are going on in your church. And out in the foyer there is a brochure from Church of the Resurrection called Missions 3.0, and on the back side of that, this happened a couple of years ago. They began the first stages of trying to do this. And I can tell you all kinds of stories that were going on as you try to get ministries within the church to define what they're doing in terms of relief, betterment, and development, because guess what? Everybody thinks what they're doing is development. But if you start defining things in a different way, then you start to work in the culture a little bit and trying to deconstruct some ideas of what's going on and trying to add into the continuum a piece that really is not there. But these are some of the early things that you can begin to do to get the church looking in terms of, what might we have to do, and how can we wrestle some funds away from this in order to be able to bring some funds, some people from this to that? How do we create on-ramps for people who get development much more quickly than others in the whole process? It's all part of the work that has to happen. Go to the next one. At the partnership level, it becomes all about execution, because that's where we're going to go do what we're going to do. We're not going to do it for them, but we're going to do it with them. And what we've discovered along the way, and Casey had it written up just a little bit differently, but oftentimes what happens in most scenarios is that we want to start with resources. We want to figure out how we can get resources in that particular context, and what we're finding is that you need to develop at the relationship level. You need to have a plan to execute. A lot of the stuff that Casey was just talking about was breaking these things down into even, a great job, thank you, Casey. I want to get those notes from you, but breaking that whole process down into other steps of what it takes to actually execute, and then finding, do you have leadership in context to be able to execute those things? And then you bring resources. If you bring resources too soon, you create a sense of dependency out of which you will, I believe, rarely ever get out of. But that's what's happening at the partnership level. There's different things to be solved there. And then if you go to the last one, it's about community transformation. It's about finding what those catalytic areas are in any particular community and then bringing resources to bear upon those in ways that make sense, that lead to self-sustaining things. I bring these things here because if churches can begin to understand that all four of those pressures are going on in every church all the time, it will force us into a deeper way of thinking about how do we integrate all of those things. My belief then is that there was a time in which a church could focus on any one of those four, and usually it would be one of the top three. Usually it would be one of the top two. It would be either at the individual or at the church level. What's the benefit for our church? What's the benefit for the individual? That's where we've been for the most part. And there was a time when we could do that, but we are quickly getting to the point where it's no longer about being able to focus on the top two. We have got to have people in our churches who can figure out how to integrate all four. And I'm not finding anybody has that totally figured out. There are huge tensions as you try to integrate the needs of the individual, the needs of the church, the needs of the partnership, and the needs of the community. But folks, that's what this is about. We've got to figure new ways. And so one of the things that we're doing is working with some churches. We're working with one here locally. And how do you construct a church around what Church of the Resurrection has called Missions 3.0? And we're hoping that you might pass this on to others. We would love to spend time with churches around the country, helping them to see that it's possible. It is possible to meet the needs of the individual, the church, the partnership, and have impact in the community. But it'll take a lot of work, a whole lot of work. So I want to thank you again for making this possible. I am so excited now about the life that Sat Talks might have beyond this day and a half that we've been together.